So what is atypical aHUS? I think most of you obviously know this, but we put as many qualifiers on this disease as we can. It's rare, it's chronic, it can be absolutely life-threatening for some children, and it is now we know complement mediated, and of course it's systemic, meaning it's going to affect many parts of the body. What is the incidence, or what is the number of new cases per year? We frankly probably don't know exactly, but at best guess it's probably 1 to 3 million. 1 to 3 million population, and the prevalence is completely unknown at this point because we're discovering more and more cases, if you will, but we don't know how many are still out there that we haven't been able to find out. Affects both adults and children. This is one of those myths. I think in general, most of us believe that it probably affects the majority. For the majority, it is in children, but in the studies that have been reported, there may be even as many as 41% of those that are reported that are actually adults. So it does affect adults, as some of our families know. So what is it? Well, it's as its name says, aHUS. The first component of that is actually this hemolytic component, if you will, and hemolytic anemia and thrombocytopenia are the key components of the hemolysis, or the key component of the hemolytic part of this disease. And in that, we generally will talk about it being a hemoglobin of less than 10. It may be a little bit higher, it may be a little bit lower. In general, we're talking about an LDH, or a lactic acid dehydrogenase, in case you ever wanted to know what LDH meant, is greater than the upper limits of normals. For some children, it can be very high. Others, it can be just above normal. We're also talking about this thing we call a low haptoglobin. We talk about schistocytes, and actually, I thought I would, it's bandied around a lot, this thing we call schistocytes, but this is actually what that is. Normally, a red cell should be this nice, round, pink thing, basically. When we're talking about schistocytes, we're talking about these little blobs of things that are completely abnormal in shape, and that's very characteristic for physicians to be able to look under the microscope and find these. So we know that schistocytes are present in this disease. And finally, this is a small point that's probably not so important to you, but it really is a Coombs negative hemolytic anemia, and that separates it from some of the other diseases. And that is very important for the physicians. And finally, we will in general talk about it needing to have a platelet count of less than 150,000. Many of you probably know exactly what your children's platelet count was on the day they presented, and you probably know exactly what it's been every day since. So we start with that less than 150, but we know that there's a huge variation in there. Finally, the U of the aHUS is renal impairment, and in fact, that really just means an abnormal creatinine. And that's also a number that I'm sure that very many of you will watch. So we have that sort of clinical presentation, and most physicians will be able to identify that, but there is also a biopsy presentation of this disease, and you can actually, it can in some ways trump the clinical presentation. And the example I will offer is if the platelets are not quite right, or if the LDH is not quite right, but if you do a biopsy and you find this thing we call a thrombotic microangiopathy, then you also at least have to entertain the idea of whether it's an atypical aHUS. This particular picture I show you is actually one of our patients, and what I would like to sort of indicate is that I know this just looks like a bunch of pink stuff to you, but this is a blood vessel here. And notice there should be a nice open area where in fact blood can flow. Unfortunately, what happens in atypical aHUS patients is it looks like this. So what happens is that blood that was flowing through there can no longer flow, and instead you've got these red cells that are stuck inside the lining of the blood cell, and particularly there may be just a frank clot there, just a collection of platelets and red blood cells that then stops flow. And that is actually, obviously a very worrisome process, but this is actually something that can be found fairly frequently in this disease. We don't always biopsy, obviously, but if you do biopsy, you might find this thing called thrombotic microangiopathy.